In 2019 I was living in Sydney and I decided to go to New Zealand for a road trip where I travel around the South Island for a couple of weeks in a van and just explore, take loads of photos and enjoy the landscape. So this video is for the Campkins camera Cambridge Photography Weekender, and I'm going to be talking about what I like about some of the photos, why I took it, composition, editing and settings. So I'll start by saying what kit I had at the time. I was shooting on a Canon 600D with a 18-200mm lens. Now that camera is sadly not with me anymore. It got wet about 2 weeks later in a kayak off an island in Bali. So I have had an upgrade, thankfully. But yeah, that's what I was shooting on, and that was the lens I had too. My style, I'd say it's sort of landscape, contemporary, sort of a mix of lifestyle and portrait. It's kind of everything really, but that's what I enjoy to shoot. I just enjoy taking photos of what's around me, whether it could be mountains, beaches, surfing, cities, people, friends, whatever's going. I also don't really do much post shooting. I don't use Photoshop anymore, so all of my photos they're fairly diluted in terms of edits, and I don't have any filters either that I put actually on my lens, apart from a UV filter. But yeah, there's no real landscape kind of filters I've got on the front of the lens, and I just use Lightroom as well to edit. Just simple retouching really. I might add quite a weak filter on it, maybe some sort of vintage filter to manipulate some colours, but that's about it really. Okay, so a lot of the photos that I took on the trip they're pretty quickly taken, just out the window, on the move, on the road. I enjoyed that. It's quite difficult though. I definitely found that I come away with a lot of photos that I just aren't even worth using because there'd be a lamppost or a tree right in the way of the shot. But that's how you learn, I think. But there's also some photos in this video that are more thoughtful and that I had more time to shoot and put together. So there's a nice mix in there. Okay, so the first photo I'd like to talk about is this one here. And I really like it. It's taken quite early in the morning, and I would have shot it quite overexposed as well. And then in the edit, I would have brought down some of the exposure, some of the highlights, but I want to keep the brightness in it too, and increase the contrast, just to really get some of the colours and the darks popping. And what I like is just the simple lines with the mist. It makes the mountains, it sort of just takes the detail away, so you're left with these really nice like ridge lines and the peak lines, and then I think that can help put the focal point on whatever's in the foreground. Another thing I like to do, I do with a lot of my photos as well, when I'm shooting in mountains, is I'll try and get the peak of the mountains almost at the top of the frame, just to make them, just to like play around with composition and size. And really I want to do the mountains, the height of them, justice, because if you were to zoom out, have your lens as wide as possible, everything is just going to look small and quite warped. Just zoom in a little bit, even if it's just a 50mm, and you really notice the difference of just how the photo feels and the sense of scale, which I think is important in this kind of scenery. So with this one, I really like how the dark trees around the corner of the shot, it almost creates a vignette, and they add a really nice contrast to the middle of the photo, which is what I wanted to capture. The mossy rock and the tree with the lovely light on it. You can really see the detail, and then naturally just framed around the outside are the dark shadows of the trees. That's what I saw it and I just had to take a photo of it. It actually reminds me of, not that I've seen the films, but it reminds me of something that might be in The Hobbit or Lord of the Rings. Maybe where there's some kind of, I don't know, somebody sat on one of the rocks, or there's something that they're just trying to show. It almost looks quite magical and enchanted. So whenever I'm travelling, I'm always on the lookout for a nice forest road photo. They're really simple to do. Obviously I make sure that there's no cars coming either way, and settings are pretty easy to get right as well. I suppose with aperture it can be a bit tricky, because if you have an aperture around the f4 kind of mark, you want to be careful, because you don't want to get just one road line in focus and then the rest are all blurred. I'm quite lazy with that, to be honest, but it's something that I am working on. But I like this photo quite a lot. I think the biggest thing to keep in mind with shooting these sort of parallel kind of compositions is that it has to be perfect. You have to get that middle line right in the centre, or else it's just not going to look quite right. Especially when you're shooting in a city, you're shooting look-up shots, or you want to get in the middle of the road and you got a perfect lineup of buildings. When you're not quite in the centre, it really throws the image off slightly. So I think it's definitely important to take your time and, you know, get your live view up, take your time, get your rule of thirds grid up, that always helps, and take your photo so it's all perfect. Another thing that I think I almost discovered actually in New Zealand was just the use of negative space. With this photo here of the waves, I think I use extreme negative space, but I like that. I think it's so simple, it's quite a contemporary look, and I find it really satisfying just to look at it. It's very calm. I like how there's just so much sky, and at the very bottom you've got those nicely contrasted waves. And in post I dip the blacks and the shadows and then increase the whites, but then I don't want anything to be blown out, so then that's where I would have taken it down on the highlights just to control it. If you put a subject in the foreground and behind it you've got the mist, like from the mountains, you find this a lot of beaches as well. It is so nice to see, because that subject, for example in this one you've got the birds, they're so easy to make good contrasts and sharp edges on them. It creates such nice depth, and there's no details in the mountains. They're just a couple of shadows or shapes, or even just lines in the background, but it's enough to know that they're there. So really what we're looking at here, we're looking at the birds flying, and you can just about see the ocean, and then the mountains at the back, they're just have enough there for you to know what the scenery is, but it doesn't take your eye off what your actual your focus is, that being the birds. And to do that I would have had an aperture of around f4, potentially f5, and that's how you get those really nice soft tones in the background. And another thing, I like to shoot beaches sometimes in black and white. If the water's gorgeous and it's crystal clear and blue and emerald, I probably wouldn't, because I think that's just stunning enough in itself. But this was very choppy, very rough seas, so the colour of it wasn't that appealing really to shoot. So black and white, loads of contrast, and I think that looks really nice. Okay, so this one, it wasn't actually golden hour. I feel like I've cheated a little bit, but what I done in Lightroom, I increased the warmth, and it was really easy actually. All of a sudden it gave this sense of golden hour, maybe a sunrise or a sunset, and I really like that. And I also I stood up on the cliff, and you could look down on the mist coming off the ocean. It was just creating the layers of the different ridge lines. Really simple, and I love how the ones closer to you they're darker, they're sharper as well, and then your eye just naturally follows down the image along the ridge line, along the road, uncovering all the other ridges. I think that looks really good. This is actually one of my favourite photos I took. Very simple, wasn't a difficult one. I just looked up and took the shot. But it's the colours that I like so much about it. It's the unsaturated greens, really easy to do. I changed the hue slightly as well, not too much though, because that can almost be too obvious. But And whenever I do this in my photos, it's usually inspired by a photographer called Inciting. He's usually about on Instagram, based in New York, and his use of colours and slightly unsaturating them, but not ever so much. I've always tried to do it, somehow I haven't been able to, but now I'm quite happy with how I am at that, and this is probably my favourite photo as an example. So the sunset photo, it's quite difficult to take actually. It was the sun was really going down and it was getting quite dark, so it wasn't left with much light on the waves or on the beach. But I also wanted to capture like some of like the driftwood and the sand in front of me. So my ISO was 800, and I didn't want to go any higher because then obviously that would create grain, which is something I definitely wanted to avoid. There is some in the photo, but that's okay. And then to avoid having blurred waves, shutter speed was high, and if you can see the birds, which were just flying and dancing around above the waves, the backdrop, it was just so perfect. This is also one of my favourite photos as well that I took on the trip, and I love the colour of the sky. I haven't seen many sunsets like that before. It went from the top of the photo, it started at like a nice dark blue, it got a bit lighter, then you hit the purples and the pinks, the yellows. So yeah, this is probably one of the most challenging photos I took there, just because of the settings. It was quite complicated, and with sunset photography, when I'm editing it, I find it's very easy to ruin it, and then you're better off just not editing it at all. So I have to be really careful with that sort of thing and not manipulate it too much, especially the colours, because it's beautiful anyway. So in terms of filters, I wouldn't have added anything at all, but just maybe a little bit of fade and controlled the grain as well as I could. And I don't want any blown out parts of the sky. So how I would control that, I would take down some of the highlights, just so you've got as much colour in that sky as possible, as opposed to having parts which is just absolutely blown out with bright white light, which to me isn't something that I wanted to do with this shot. So with this photo, as you can see in the very bottom right hand corner, there's a slight blur of grass. I've been doing this for a few years now. I think it creates a great sort of sense of distance and scale. Best way to achieve this, zoom in around the 80mm mark and above. It's going to make that bokeh really smooth, and I get that lens pretty much in the grass or in the trees, just to get it as blurry and as smooth as possible, and then it creates a really nice way to frame what you're actually focusing on. So this photo would be the wave. So that's what I tried to do there, and I think it turned out quite nice. So another big thing that I wanted to talk about with outdoor photography is placement of people in the photo. So this one, I took the photo in portrait orientation, so you can't see it all, but you can see quite a lot of the water at the bottom, and then there was mountains above those trees as well as sky. So I think it's really important to put your subject right in the middle or slightly to the side, again using rule of thirds. It really complements the surroundings. Also, if you have control over what they're wearing, a red coat looks absolutely great. Also, yellow Romac does wonders too in the outdoors. But this red coat, I think looks great in front of water, looks great in front of hazy backgrounds, even snow, which is one of the reasons why I like this photo so much actually. This was another photo that I come away really happy with. Took it early in the morning, just after getting up. And it didn't take much editing at all, actually. This is, I think you know when you've got a good photo when you hardly touch the edit. And this was one of those. All I done, slightly dehazed it, which means that anything which is obviously hazed out, which is in most photos really, basically adds contrast, but in a slightly different way than what adding contrast does. So I dehazed it, added a little bit of contrast, dropped the blacks and the shadows, just to create even more sort of richness in the photo. And then I applied just a light filter actually, just to slightly manipulate those greens and the yellow tones in the air. This tourist shot I think is quite interesting. There's another one where I played around with scale, put the subject, being the tourists in the buses, right at the bottom, and zoomed in around the 80mm mark, and that then blows up the mountains, all of that, to quite a correct scale, which makes those people look even smaller. And that's how it feels when you're there. Obviously mountains are huge, and I think it's great in photos when the people, they just look so small and almost vulnerable. I think that is something that nature's great at, and that's what I try and almost compliment when I'm shooting in these sort of scenes. And the mist, I was just lucky that was there. I think that really complements it. I think it looks great how it's just sort of swelled up from that bright grass, and also the bottom of the photo, all that grass being so light, when there's people walking through it. What I wanted to do, I wanted them to stand out. It creates that sort of silhouette contrast, which really helped with this photo. This is the photo of Mount Cook. I like it. It's not my favourite photo. I suppose, so this is their sort of staple mountain. It's the largest one on the island, and I envisioned the photo I come away with it being the best I'd taken. But conditions aren't always in your favour. So obviously it was a gorgeous day. It was so sunny, and this is at Lake Pukaki, which is usually one of those really intense blue sort of Canadian looking lakes. But that only comes out looking like that at certain times of day with a certain sunlight and no wind. Also there were clouds in it, which that presented some problems in the edit. I dehazed it, but the more you do that, the more it looks like you're adding so much clarity, and then it just doesn't look quite right. It lacks quality of the image. It's like extreme contrast, so I had to be really careful with that. But I also wanted to add more punch to those clouds, which is what dehaze helped me do. And also, it's a very blue photo. A lot of mountains are going to look like that in photography. So I would have manipulated the blue tones in the image slightly, but not so much, because if you unsaturate them too much, then there's just no colour in that photo, because that is the majority colour of the image. So only slightly I took out some of the saturation of the blues, but really just not too much, because then it would have lost all of its vibrance. So this is the last photo that I want to talk about. It's also one of my favourites too that I took. I didn't realise that I liked it so much a few months later, after flicking through hard drives just of anything to post on Instagram. And I come across this, I edited it, and I absolutely love it. So yeah, I want to talk about composition with this photo. Same with the other photos that I've spoken about, really. Got the subject, that's the car, down at the bottom, and I really took it, I think, to the limit really, with how far in the corner I put that car. And I've done that again. I want to make it look vulnerable, I want to make it look really small, capture part of that road, keep that really simple, because obviously the rest of the image is filled by mountains, which is it's why you go there. It's why that road is there, so that people can enjoy that scenery. But I just wanted to add a slight, almost the realistic side to it. You know, the reality of it is, you know, cars driving up and down there around this scenery, and again, I think it gives a great sense of scale, just how big those mountains are. And another thing I like about this image is that behind that first ridgeline, where the second mountain is, the sun is coming through in between the mountains, and it's lighting up so nicely. And I think that without that, it would almost look a bit flat. Because it's there, it gives such a nice sense of depth and detail as well on that particular part of the mountain, which is probably my favourite part about that image. So there's some of my favourite photos that I took in New Zealand. Yeah, I took them in 2019. I've taken a lot of photos since then with a new setup, but these are still some of my favourite, and I think my strongest photos that I've ever taken. So I hope you may have learnt something or taken away something from this video. That would be great if you had. My name's Alfie Cox, and I can't wait to go and shoot some more of the world whenever we can. I've also got some prints available that I'm selling, that we have seen in this video. Not all of them, just I think there's 5 I'm selling, and they look really nice on print. So that's another thing I'd recommend anyone do. If you've got some photos that you're particularly proud of, get them printed, because it feels great, and it's so nice seeing them actually on a piece of paper rather than on a screen. And that's a whole new thing to learn as well, all the papers and the print sizes as well, that it keeps it interesting. And that can all be found on my Instagram bio, which is hopefully linked in the description of this. So thank you, Campkins Camera, for allowing me to talk about my trip. Like I said, it was just a trip of a lifetime, and I hope to go back as soon as I can. And thank you for watching. Cheers.